Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, February 14th, 2025. Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
I apologize for the delay, but I'm delighted to join you.
My pleasure. Let's get started, Ambassador, with what J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, said at the Munich Security Conference. I'm going to play a clip that he's talking about the the groups or people who are participating in this security conference.
Conference have banned lawmakers representing populist parties on both the left and the right from participating in these conversations. Now, again, we don't have to agree with everything or anything that people say. But when when political leaders represent an important constituency, it is incumbent upon us to at least participate in dialogue with them. Now, to many of us on the other side of the Atlantic, it looks more and more like old entrenched interests.
Ambassador, we had the defense minister of Germany responding to J.D. Vance. How did you find his speech?
Well, it was quite a difficult thing for Europeans to hear. It obviously will please much of the Trump constituency because it was very hardline. There is, I must say, a certain irony in Vice President Vance extolling the virtues of dialogue and free speech when the Trump administration is taking action to silence anyone who speaks about Palestine or genocide. In fact, the Trump administration is going after universities, and the main explainer of the policy of going after universities is J.D. Vance. So there's a certain irony here. I'm not sure how much credibility he has on that subject or the Trump administration. But the most important parts of the speech were about the transatlantic relationship. And when you put these together with what newly appointed Defense Secretary Hegseth said, I think you can draw several conclusions. One is that the United States is downgrading the strategic importance of Europe and turning to the Pacific. There's always been a debate among our strategists over whether we should emphasize the Atlantic or the Pacific. We face both. In World War II, we put priority on the Atlantic, on Europe. And now I think it's clear we have switched to the Pacific. So basically the message is you Europeans are going to have to take care of your own security. You're going to have to spend more and so forth. The assumption is that NATO will continue to exist as it is, despite the eruption of multiple disputes between the United States and allies, including, in the case of Denmark, a proposed takeover of the territory of a fellow NATO member. I should add that Canada, also a NATO member, is menaced with annexation. These are not the sort of behavior that preserves alliances. So I think that the withdrawal of the United States or the downgrading of Europe in American strategic thinking, plus the reduction of forces that will take place, does challenge Europeans to come up with their own security system. Whether they can do that or not is another question. To date, one has to say that they deserve the disparagement that American leaders give them. Finally, however, I would note Mr. Vance's, Vice President Vance's speech was arrogant, condescending, and insulting. And I think it probably offended most of the audience, at least the European audience. Not, I suppose, the Hungarian delegation, which may have been the source of the sole applause later in the speech. Mr. Vance finally is clearly intervening in European politics on behalf of populist right-wing parties. I note that he met with Alternative für Deutschland, the German right-wing party, which has heretofore been regarded, at least by Europeans, as beyond the pale. I myself would argue that there's an old diplomatic adage that you should always be in with the outs. And the alternative for Deutschland is a rising power in German politics, and it would be a great mistake to ignore it. So that aspect of Mr. Vance's visit seems to have been an intelligent investment in diplomacy, even if it somewhat shocked other German parties.
Here is what Pete Hegseth said about the conflict in Ukraine.
Representing inside these negotiations. So my job today and in Brussels was to introduce realism to the conversation. The reality that returning to 2014 as borders as part of a negotiated settlement is unlikely. The reality of U.S. troops in Ukraine is unlikely. The reality of Ukraine membership in NATO as a part of a negotiated settlement, unlikely. And I stand by the comments that I made on that first day in the Ukraine contact group. And that.
Well, he's reacting to the pushback from Europeans, which is entirely understandable. But he's absolutely correct. He's saying out loud what was said in the back rooms between people who did not want to admit to the citizens of their countries that the war in Ukraine has essentially been lost. So, I mean, when he says it's not likely that Ukraine will be part of NATO, it's certain that Ukraine will not be part of NATO. And when he says, as he did, that the U.S. will not be in Ukraine as part of any post-conflict peacekeeping force, he's telling the Europeans, this is your problem, not ours, even if we made it for you. So from the European point of view, this is an abrupt reversal of what appeared to be a very strong American policy of using Ukraine to inhibit, to reduce, to weaken and isolate Russian forces and the perceived Russian threat to Europe, which in my view has been greatly exaggerated. In any event, the problem here is really diplomatic. In the case of Vice President Vance, it was the tone of his address, which was arrogant and condescending, as I mentioned. In the case of Mr. Hegseth, it is the absence of a diplomatic context. It is not apparent that anybody talked to the Europeans before he made these announcements. It is clear that the Europeans want to be at the table if there is a negotiation with Russia about Ukraine. It is essential that Ukraine be represented in any discussions rather than having something imposed on it. And I note that we've had a telephone call, now admitted, an open telephone call between President Trump and President Putin. And they seem to have agreed to start at least the foreplay for negotiations. It's not clear that they really have agreed to negotiate. I understand that representatives of the two sides will begin meeting in Saudi Arabia, and the expectation is that this will lead to a direct meeting, a summit between President Trump and President Putin. Here, I would note that there's a lot of preparatory work that has to be done. It's an old adage of diplomacy that the problem with summits is that if the chief of state or government fumbles, now I'm using an American football analogy, drops the ball, then the goal is open to the other side. So there's no goalie to stop a score. So you have to be well prepared for a summit. The purpose of summits is not to arrange settlements, it is to ratify them. So we are beginning a process of negotiation I will note one element of what both Vice President Vance and Secretary of Defense Higgs has said, which apparently shocked the Europeans, and that is that we're talking to the Russians. We have not been talking to the Russians. In the view of a lot of people, including myself, that has been an outrageous omission. I'm glad to see contact begin, dialogue initiated. Whether it will succeed in arranging a settlement of the Ukraine issue or not remains to be seen. And here, as we've discussed before, I pointed out there are multiple parties at interest. Obviously, Ukraine has an interest in establishing a border with Russia that is secure and in fitting into some sort of security architecture in Europe that makes it feel secure. Obviously, the Russians have a compelling interest in protecting the Russian speakers in Ukraine. So the Hungarians have an interest in Hungarian speakers, the Romanians in Romanian speakers, and others. But one of the suggestions that has been made is that in order to establish the level of armament that Ukraine would have after peace, we should involve countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Belarus, as well as Russia and Germany, in a discussion looking to some kind of arms control arrangement which limits deployments and provides confidence building measures. That seems to me to be a reasonable suggestion. Then we have the issue of the broader issue of European security architecture. Russia wants a peace in Europe. It doesn't want Ukraine as a whole. It does not want to be menaced from Ukraine. It will not accept foreign troops from the West Europeans any more than it would accept American troops on its border. It wants a neutral Ukraine in a broader security framework that reassures it and also reassures the West that the Russian threat does not exist or is controllable. So these are very complicated items. There can be a discussion between the US and Russia to set broad principles. Some people have suggested that China might assist in that. The Saudis have clearly been willing to offer a venue for those discussions. But the Europeans have to be in on this. And Ukraine and Ukraine's neighbors have to be in on this if it is to succeed. The basic principle of any negotiation is that you have to get buy-in from anyone who has the capacity to wreck the outcome. And there are a lot of people in Europe who could wreck the outcome, not just the Russians, not just the Ukrainians, others. So this is very complicated and it's just at the beginning. And I note that the fighting, as I predicted, has not stopped as negotiations begin. You're muted.
Here is what Ursula von der Leyen said, Ambassador.
Needs peace through strength. Europe wants peace through strength.
Ambassador, do they really know what they really want about Ukraine and about what is peace through strength for Ukraine, for example, for instance? And how can they achieve it? Is that the continuation of the conflict? And how long it has to continue to achieve what's in their mind? I don't know what would that be.
Peace through strength, I think, is an indirect or implied reference to the sellout of Czechoslovakia at Munich in 1938. So this is the reaction of von der Leyen and other Europeans that what Mr. Trump proposes is appeasement of Russia. But as Churchill pointed out, there are some circumstances in which appeasement is appropriate. And in fact, I would say I could give a good, wonderful set of examples of how Great Britain appeased the United States as we rose to world power and benefited from that. So the reflexive reference to Munich, in Munich, is obvious. you ask, do the Europeans know what they want in Ukraine? The answer is clearly no. The only parties who clearly understand what they want are Russia, which has been very clear about what it wants: a neutral Ukraine with no foreign troops on its soil, protection for the Russian-speaking minority, and a broader arrangement for security in Europe that reflects the fact that the Cold War is over and that does not leave Europe divided into hostile blocs. The Ukrainians know what they want. They want all their territory back. I think the Europeans don't know what they want. And I don't think the United States has really focused on Ukraine until now. That is to say, the purpose of this war from the American point of view was, as stated by former Secretary of Defense Austin, to weaken and isolate Russia. It was not to do anything particular for or in Ukraine. The focus was Russia. The focus was the perceived Russian threat, which has been greatly exaggerated, as many people have pointed out. So this all comes back to a basic principle, again, of statecraft. You should never start a war without a war termination strategy. You should know what end state you want to produce. You should know what the objective is. You should be prepared to put adequate resources in play to support and achieve the objective. All of these principles have essentially been violated in the case of Ukraine. There has been no clear objective. The resources have been inadequate and rightly complained about. And there's no war termination strategy. And we're now down to the moment when we have to terminate the war. President Trump is absolutely correct about that. The question is how.
What would be, in your opinion, you talk about the security architecture between Europeans and Russia. In your opinion, what would be that framework of this sort of security architecture? What are the main or the most important points in that sort of agreement?
Well, I think the basic framework has to be defined mainly by Europeans, although the United States would be a guarantor of it. We're talking about a moment of statecraft that resembles the Peace of Westphalia or the Concert of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna. That is rearranging the rules of the game in Europe to reduce the danger of conflict. This is a fundamental task, and it's not easy. And in the end, picking up on what Vice President Vance and the Secretary of Defense said, Europeans are going to have to be responsible for crafting their own defenses. And I would argue that this does not mean 5% spending on defense budgets, 5% of GDP. This is not a military issue. It is a political military issue or a political diplomatic issue. And the object should be to reduce defense spending, not expand it, and to reduce tensions, not entrench them. So this is a challenge that we have not even begun to really think about, I think.
Yeah. And about Donald Trump talking with Vladimir Putin in Saudi Arabia, why does Donald Trump not consider Europe to be part of that sort of talks? Because we know Europe, after all, is so important.
Well, I think, as I've said before, there are going to have to be multiple forums in these negotiations. Mr. Trump is basically responding to Mr. Putin's set of demands in December 2021, which the previous administration ignored and refused to discuss. And I would expect the Russians actually to table those demands once again. I don't see that they would have changed them. The one change would be retention of the 4 oblasts, Russian-speaking, majority Russian-speaking oblasts that Russia now controls in whole or in part. It controls one of them completely, the other 3 in part. It will insist on that. Why? Because it agreed that those oblasts should remain part of Ukraine, provided that their inhabitants had linguistic, cultural rights and a degree of autonomy that the Ukrainians agreed to, and then decided they would not agree to. Those are the Minsk Accords, the 2 of them. Those cannot be reinstated now, and so the Russians will insist on retaining that territory. That is the only change. That is a detail. This war was not about Russia taking Ukrainian territory, although the West chose to portray it that way. It was about peace in Europe, about neutrality for Ukraine, about precluding active threats to Russia on its borders. This is what it was about. Those questions are going to have to be answered. And it may be a shock to people who have been subject to fierce propaganda and information warfare suggesting that all this is about Russian territorial ambitions, rebuilding the Tsarist Empire, or so forth, and preparing to attack Western Europe. There's no evidence for any of that. But this war has had elements of fratricide because Ukrainians and Russians are very closely related. Their languages are very similar. Their history is entwined. Ukraine was never a state, of independent state. It was part of the Soviet Union as a component republic. It was represented in the United Nations as such, independently, supposedly. So was Belarus. These 2 parts of the Soviet Union had independent representation in the UN, but nobody believed they were truly independent. So there's a lot to sort out here, and Ukraine is going to have to bite the bullet. It is not. It has not succeeded on the battlefield, and I think Mr. Secretary of Defense Hegseth was correct to point that out, and correct to stand his ground in saying I meant what I said, even if he was somewhat apologetic about it.
Ambassador, when you look at European leaders and the way that they're trying to picture the conflict in Ukraine as though that Ukraine is the main, I don't know, the main port or the main gate of Europe that through which Russia can march toward Europe, and the way that they're seeing Ukraine is so exaggerated. But what's in it for them, in your opinion? Why they're not considering? Because Donald Trump and his administration, it seems to me that they're trying to help them. After all, they're gonna benefit from what's going on in Ukraine if they find some sort of political solution for the conflict. But it doesn't seem that they're so satisfied with the attitude on the part of the Trump administration.
Well, they've had a pretty good deal for the last 80 years. That 80 years ago, World War II ended. The United States intended to withdraw from Europe, but the Cold War, as a result of the Cold War and a series of incidents in places like Berlin, we ended up staying. And ever since then, the Europeans have been able to depend on the United States for their defense. And you ask why they behave the way they do. They did. I think in large measure, it's because they wanted to ingratiate themselves with the United States as their protector. But what they've just been told is the United States is not going to act as their protector anymore, and they need to take responsibility for their own defense. That will require them to do all sorts of things that are very difficult politically. For example, they don't have an integrated military-industrial system. Each country has its national champions. They cooperate sometimes on some systems, but for the most part, their procurement favors their own nationality rather than being pan-European. There is no pan-European force. Other than NATO, there has been something called the Western European Union, talked about as a military arm of the European Union, but it's more of a tea party than an army. So Europeans, the logical request that Europeans should make as part of restructuring the transatlantic relationship is to be in charge of NATO, that the United States remain a member of NATO, have a continuing support role, but that they take command of their own destiny. This is the logical thing for them to do. They probably won't do that because they would not agree who should be in charge, a Frenchman, a German, an Italian, a Spaniard, a Portuguese, who's going to be in charge? A Pole? Poland at the moment has the most serious rearmament effort of any European country underway. And it is a major power in Europe as a result. So European disunity and the cowardice of European politicians and the selfishness of political parties all get in the way of Europe becoming more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah. And the Donald Trump talked about the situation in Gaza with the King of Jordan and his plan about sending or displacing people, Palestinians, from their land to Egypt and Jordan. Right now, Egypt says that they have a plan for, without displacing people from Gaza, they can rebuild Gaza. Do you think that Donald Trump would consider any sort of plan on the part of Egypt or any other country?
No, in effect, he has given Israel and Zionists exactly what they've always wanted, the opportunity to empty Palestine of Palestinians. And he's not only done it with respect to Gaza, where he said the Palestinians must leave and then can't come back, but he's also basically endorsed the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. So he has embraced the Zionist agenda entirely. I think the Egyptians and others, the Saudis and others who have talked about, rebuilding Gaza with Palestinian labor, Palestinians remaining there, are, talking about something that is entirely possible, but politically unacceptable to Israel, and therefore to Donald Trump, who is very much the follower of the Zionist line, and in fact may have committed himself in return for a $100 million contribution from the widow of the late casino owner Sheldon Adelson to facilitate the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank and its formal annexation by Israel. I note that he has also raised no objection. In fact, he has supported the Israeli entrenchment of its military in Syrian territory beyond the former buffer zone patrolled by the United Nations. So that is not realistic. Nor is it realistic to expect that Jordan could accept additional Palestinian refugees. 60% of Jordanians are Palestinian refugees. Jordan is overburdened with refugees from Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. And so the humiliation of King Abdullah, very painful expression on his face throughout all this, looked as though he was experiencing the awkwardness of dealing with a madman. It's very hard to sit there with a straight face while somebody it says all sorts of extremely unrealistic, fantastic things, which Mr. Trump did. Netanyahu did not help by proposing the Saudis carve out some of their territory for the Palestinians. Egypt absolutely cannot accept the Palestinians in Sinai or in Egypt proper, because that would totally disrupt Egyptian politics. And it might well lead to the overthrow of the military dictatorship in Egypt. If the Saudis acquiesced, or the Emiratis, who, by the way, Emiratis, are seen as champions of American foreign policy in the region, but they too have objected to this, I wouldn't call it a plan, musing by Mr. Trump, whimsical musing about how to get rid of the Palestinians for the Israelis. They have objected to this also. So have China and Russia. I don't know of anyone other than Israel that has approved of this, which tells you something.
Ambassador, do you think that Israeli lobby in the United States under Donald Trump is getting stronger, is getting more influential on the administration, or it's going to be the same as we've seen with the Biden administration?
Well, they're contradictory trends. On the one hand, Jewish communities in the United States are increasingly estranged from Israel and no longer wish to be associated with it or support it. So particularly younger Jews are disenchanted with Zionism. But on the other hand, Mr. Trump is clearly the prisoner of the lobby. They can pretty much tell him what to do, apparently, and he does it. Whether he does it because of his, upbringing in New York, which is heavily Zionist in orientation, or whether he does it because it was financially beneficial to him, or because he thinks like a real estate developer rather than a statesman, is not clear. But no, I don't think the lobby has a hammerlock on him. He is very much the prisoner of them and of Mr. Netanyahu.
Do you think that he considers the way that Turkey is talking about? Even Erdogan said it's out of question the way that Donald Trump is talking about Gazans. As you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of these Arab states are talking this way. But when King of Jordan was next to Donald Trump, you see, as you mentioned, you see the pressure that he's feeling. And to what extent Donald Trump is able to put pressure on these Arab states together with Turkey?
Well, several observations. First, he's basically threatening to end the aid to Egypt and Jordan, which is part of the Camp David Accords. That is to say, Egypt receives aid basically because that keeps it at peace with Israel, despite the fact that it is a cold peace. Jordan has always been very dependent on foreign assistance from the United States. Before the 1990-91 Gulf War, it was dependent on Saudi Arabia, but King Hussein, the previous ruler in Jordan, sided with Saddam Hussein during that war and was basically cut off by the Saudis. So now Jordan is heavily dependent on USAID, which the Trump administration is abolishing. They exempted Jordan and Egypt in order to keep the Camp David Accords in place, but Mr. Trump is now threatening to abolish them. If he does, the Arabs are trying to come up with a plan to substitute their aid for ours, perhaps in association with others. So Egypt and Jordan really can't survive without foreign assistance. Egypt can, but both of them are now looking with Arab partners for alternatives to U.S. dependency on the United States. The second observation I would make is that while pan-Arab nationalism has not been reborn, for the first time in ever, really, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have succeeded in uniting the Arabs behind a common cause, which is Palestinian self-determination in Palestine, and no acceptance of ethnic cleansing along the lines of the Nakba in 1948. This is quite an achievement. These are still very selfish, independent, not very cooperative states, but they now have a common cause behind which to unite, and they are uniting. And interestingly, this brings them also into unity with Turkey under Erdogan and Iran under Pezeshkian. The effect of the Trump initiative or fantasy, if you will, has been to create a coalition against the United States and Israel. And the interim step is, of course, as you indicated earlier, or you mentioned, an effort to put forward a plan to reconstruct Gaza without evicting the Palestinians. And as I indicated, I think that's going to meet fierce Israeli opposition, and therefore Mr. Trump will also be opposed to it.
Washington Post reported that the intelligence in the United States came to a conclusion that Israel would attack Iran with or without the United States on Iranian nuclear facilities. How do you see that sort of mindset on the part of Israelis right now? Do you think that they're still thinking of it?
Yes, I do. I note that while the Trump administration apparently has told Israel pretty bluntly that the United States will not join in an attack on Iran, it has provided enormous bunker-busting bombs called the mother of all bombs, Moab, I think 11 of them, to Israel. This is unprecedented. These are clearly for use against Iran and not relevant to any other conflict that Israel is currently engaged in. So on the one hand, the administration appears to have distanced itself from any thought of joining in an attack on Iran. But on the other hand, it has taken steps that facilitate an Israeli attack. And I see the Iranian government reacting to this with an intensified rearmament program. Also, of course, the new pact with Russia, which gives Iran opportunities it didn't have. But yes, I think one has to take that intelligence finding seriously.
One of the topics that it seems that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin would talk about in Saudi Arabia would be the West Asia. And how do you see the policy of Russia in the West Asia? I'm talking about Middle East, Gaza altogether.
Well, as it's clear that Russia has assigned priority to Ukraine in its foreign policy and to Europe, to finding a basis for a peace and assured security with its fellow European countries. And that West Asia is therefore a secondary concern for Russia. On the other hand, Russia is very concerned. It's negotiating with the new government in Syria to ensure that the Syrian government, which is run by jihadis, does not provide safe haven or support to Islamist terrorists who might attack Russia, which has a very significant Muslim population, most of them minorities who are, a bit unsettled and volatile. We've seen brutal wars in Chechnya. We've seen interventions in Dagestan, and we've seen terrorist acts of a frightening nature, not just in the outlying areas of Russia, but in Moscow. So this is a Russian concern, and Russia wants a stable Middle East, which West Asia, which does not pose a threat. Russia is working with Iran, by the way, in transit through the region, connectivity. It's not quite the Belt and Road level initiative, but the north-south corridor, starting with Chabahar and going up overland into Russia, and then proceeding from Chabahar to India, is very much on the drawing board and under construction. There's also, of course, Chinese construction now committed over the Karakoram mountains through Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan into Iran. So the region is diversifying its connections north and east. And this is something I'm sure that should be mentioned in Riyadh when the parties meet. But I suspect their focus will also be like the Russian focus on Europe and Ukraine, and that these secondary issues, important as they are to the countries in the region, will remain secondary.
Do we know what does Donald Trump want from China in terms of the conflict in Ukraine?
We don't. We know that he would like to be seen as a peacemaker. He wants to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. He sees his relationship with Xi Jinping as a very important asset in that drive. He has now apparently talked on the phone with Xi Jinping, although it's not clear what, if anything, was accomplished by that. I think the basic problem that President Trump faces is that he has a well-deserved reputation for not keeping his word. You know, he makes commitments and then breaks them. Ask the Canadians and Mexicans. You know, he devised a new trade framework, and his first thing he does when he comes back into office is basically to repudiate it. So we don't know what he wants from China. He clearly has embraced much of the anti-China economic warfare and technological warfare that we've seen. But even there, he's a little unclear as his handling of TikTok shows. You know, he suspended for 75 days the requirement that TikTok in North America sell itself to an American investor. I just note in passing that's rather ironic, because TikTok is largely owned in China by American investors. In ByteDance, its mother company. So this is quite ridiculous. But anyway, lots of things are ridiculous at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
I again apologize for the delay in my arrival, but I'm happy to have spoken with you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Take care, Ambassador.